Good morning, boys and girls. It's Auntie Janet checking in, and today is week number 5 of our story, Rainbow Garden. We're going to finish our story this week and let you know what happens to Elaine. If you remember last week, at the end of last week, this is where we ended off. There is Peter with the policeman and demanding to get across the street as they tried to follow the burglar. They had found him while they were in town eating their ice cream. But the policeman stopped Peter and told him no, he must not run out in traffic. It was too dangerous. And instead, he suggested to Peter and Elaine and Janet to go home and get their parents to go into the police station and make a report that they had found the man who had broken into Philippa's house. Well, Peter went home with Janet and Elaine, and they told Mr. Owen all about what had happened and how they had seen the man. And he very proudly said, "I will be Detective Peter, and if I ever see that man again, I will recognize him and will catch him and make sure he gets put in jail for what he's done." The children finished packing, and the very next morning it was time for them to go on their camping trip. They packed all the children, Mr. and Mrs. Owen and Elaine, into the car with all their camping gear, and they went out into the country where they found the spot for them to camp. It was a large hill to get up, and Mr. Owen joked that they had so much luggage that he didn't know if the car would make it up the hill. But they did, and they found a nice flat area, and they took out their tents and worked together as a family to set up their campsite. I don't know if you've ever been camping, but it's kind of a lot of work to get it all set up. But together they worked. They took the tents out. So you see here, they nailed in the pegs to tie down the tents. They got all the things ready for where they would be cooking and their sleeping bags. And their mom and dad let them have a bit of fun while they were doing things. Here is a lake nearby, and it was the most beautiful, clear water. There was birds flying, and the kids just couldn't wait to go swimming. Once everything was set up, they had a great time exploring and swimming. And the tent campsite was very close to a farm, so they were on the top of a hill and they could look down, and below it was a farm with lots of sheep, and they could even hear the sheep bleating and baaing, and it was a beautiful place. After a very fun first day of camping, it was time for supper, and they were going to, you see here, there's the camp pit, the fire pit, and that's where they cooked supper. Mrs. Owen and Mr. Owen got a fire going. She used her frying pan there, and they cooked up the most delicious supper of bacon and eggs, and even roasted the potatoes. She wrapped the potatoes in foil and aluminum foil, and they put it down into the coals to bake the potatoes, and Elaine thought it was the most wonderful supper she had ever eaten. How could things taste so good being cooked outside on a campfire? Well, after supper, as was the Owens family practice, they had their time of family worship. And they sat together outside around the campfire, and Mr. Owen read from the Bible. And the passage he read was a passage that tells us that Jesus is a good shepherd. And just as a shepherd looks after his sheep, Jesus looks after those whom he loves and his children. And it was interesting because as he read the story from the Bible, the kids could actually hear sheep still talking and baaing from the farm below. Well, it was time for bed, and as Elaine went into the tent with her and Janet and some of the smaller children, she looked out through the tent flap and began to look around at the stars, and it was beautiful. And just before she drifted off to sleep, she began to think about Jesus being her good shepherd. And she remembered now that she was a child of God and had asked Jesus to be her Savior, she knew that Jesus would always look after her, no matter where she was, whether she was living with the Owens or whether she went back one day to live with her mom in the city. And as she thought about that, she thought, oh, I really don't want to go back and live in the city anymore. She had grown to love the Owens and living in the country and being with all the children. But she knew that maybe the path that God had for her was to go back to the city to be with her mom. So before she went to bed that night, she prayed and said, "Dear God, help me to make the right choice and to follow you. I know you'll be with me and look after me, just like a shepherd looked after his sheep. And you'll look after me no matter where I go, whether I stay with the Owens or go back with my mom. Well, with thoughts of sheep and Jesus being the good shepherd in her mind, she drifted off to sleep. The next morning, everybody woke early, and it wasn't quite as sunny as it was the day before. It was kind of a cloudy day, but it wasn't too cold. And they got up, and once again, Mrs. Owen cooked them breakfast beside the fire. And they ate a good breakfast, and the rule was that each day one of the kids would help Mrs. Owen clean up from the breakfast dishes, and they would each take a turn. Well, on this particular day, it was Janet's turn to help. But Peter and Elaine made plans. While Janet was helping her mom clean up, they got permission from Mr. and Mrs. Owen to use Peter's new map and his new compass that he bought, and they wanted to go off and explore. Mrs. Owen told them, be careful. And Peter, 12-year-old Peter, was very confident and said, don't worry, Mom, I've got my compass and my map. We won't get lost. We're going to explore. So off he and Elaine went, following some paths, some walking paths, and he would look at his map and they'd follow. They had a wonderful time. They had been gone about an hour. When I told you it had been kind of a cloudy day, when as they were walking on the path and exploring and having adventures, Peter and Elaine noticed that not only was it cloudy, but it had started to get very, very foggy. The clouds had come down and they couldn't see very well. The visibility to see where they were, they had been able to look back and see where the campsite was when they first started exploring, but they lost that when the fog came in. They walked around for a while, and even though Peter was very confident that he could find his way home, he was kind of lost. So they decided to walk to the side of the path and stood beside a big rock, and he said, just let me check my map again and my compass. I'm sure I can find our way home, Elaine. Don't worry. We'll find our way back to the campsite. And Elaine was getting a little bit nervous. Did Peter really know what he was talking about? Anyway, they stood by this big rock and they were talking quietly going there when suddenly they heard footsteps. And they thought, oh, and Peter looked and he could see a shape of somebody coming up the path, and they made a decision. Should they talk to this stranger or should they be quiet? And they decided, no, let's not say anything to the stranger. Let's hide behind the rock and see who it is. So they tucked in behind this large rock and noticed this person getting closer. The closer the person got, they realized it was a man. The closer he got, lo and behold, who was it? But it was the man who had broken into Philippa's house. Peter put his hand on Elaine and put his finger to his mouth to say, shh, don't say anything. They stayed behind the rock. The man didn't see them and he walked by. As soon as he walked by, Elaine nudged Peter and said, Peter, it's him. I know it's him, Elaine. What are we going to do? We need to tell Dad. It's him. He's here in the woods too. Peter just said, no, we can't go tell Dad. We don't even know how to find the campsite. Let's follow him, Elaine. We'll find out where he's hiding, and then we'll go back and we can tell the police to catch him. Elaine didn't think this was a great idea. Peter said, don't worry, we'll be quiet. He won't hear us. And he took off. Elaine didn't have any choice but to follow Peter. And Peter walked much faster than her, and he was going and walking, and she knew she had to be quiet and not talk, even though she wanted to say, wait up for me, Peter. So in order for her to be able to keep up with Peter, she had to jog. And as she was jogging along the path, she didn't watch where she was going, and she tripped and fell flat on her face. She had dirt in her mouth and wiped the dirt off, and man, her hands hurt and sort of shook her up. But she got up, wiped the dirt off, and knew she had to follow Peter. When she got up, she came up ahead, and the path went in two different directions. And she didn't know where Peter had gone. Peter didn't know that Elaine had fallen behind, and he was on the trail to try and find the man. And there was Elaine at a cross in the road, hurt, dirty, alone. Where was Peter? She didn't dare call out for him because she didn't want the man who had robbed Philippa's house to hear her. So she was by herself. She made a choice. I'm going to follow that path. And off she went. She walked and walked and walked and walked. Then she got, oh no, he couldn't be this way. So she turned around, went back, and went up the other path and walked, For 2 hours she walked around, and she didn't realize it, but she was actually walking in circles, and she was so mixed up she didn't know where she was, and she was suddenly very frightened. Can you imagine walking in the foggy woods by yourself, not knowing where Peter was, and not knowing if 1 minute later you could run into the bad man who had broken into Philippa's house? She was starting to get discouraged, and she was getting very close to starting to cry, and she decided she would walk the path one more time. And as she was walking, she decided to start jogging because she was getting nervous, and she started to jog. And because she wasn't watching what she was doing again, she didn't know that the path was at the edge of a cliff. And as she was jogging, the ground underneath was kind of damp and wet, and her foot slipped. You can see here she doesn't have good shoes on. Her foot slipped, and the next thing she knew, she was tumbling head over heels down the side of a large embankment. She rolled head over heels, boom, 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 boom. And when she fell and finally came to a stop, her right leg was twisted underneath her, and oh, it hurt so badly. Ow, ow, or as we say in Afrikaans, Eina. She hurt so bad. Her arm was cut. She was beat up and bruised, and her leg. She tried to move it. She couldn't move it. Oh no. Now she was all alone, and she started to panic. She didn't care anymore if someone hurt her. In fact, she knew she needed help, because when she tried to move her leg, she couldn't move it, and thought, oh no, have I broken my leg? So she did what the only thing she knew that she could do. She started calling, help, help. She screamed over and over again, help me, someone help me. It felt like forever that she screamed this, but really it was only a couple of minutes. Please help me, help me. And she heard a voice and said, who's there? A deep voice. Who's there? Help, help. It wasn't Peter's voice. And when she looked up, she heard and saw the shape of someone at the top of the hill, and knew it was a man. And when she looked up, oh no, it was the robber. It was the man who she didn't want to find her. There he was. He could see her laying in a pile at the bottom of this hill, and he carefully slid and came down, he says, and came down to the side, and there was Elaine. No, it couldn't be him. When she saw him, she said, I know you. You're the little girl from the garden. You're the little girl who I saw in town, and you tried to chase me. I know who you are. Get up, he said in a mean voice. Elaine put her hands over her face and just started to scream, no, not you, no. Get up, he said. Stop screaming. Elaine looked at him. She was so scared. She said, I can't get up. What do you mean you can't get up? I can't. My leg. I think I've broken my leg. And the man leaned down, and Elaine didn't know, but he leaned down. He says, oh, and he looked, and when he saw her leg, he knew she had broken her leg. And he said, we must get you to help. And she was so scared, she started to scream again. But the man said, don't scream. And when he reached down to pick her up, she could smell that he had been drinking whiskey again. Oh, she was so frightened, but there was nothing she could do. The man gently lifted her up and carried her. And as he started to carry her, Elaine, from the pain in her leg and partly from fright, fainted. She fainted and didn't know what was happening. Where was this man going to take her, and what was he going to do with her? Well, I told you she fainted. She lost consciousness for a while. And what she didn't know was that this man actually was very kind to her. He picked her up, he carried her, and as he carried her, looked at her and thought, what a poor little girl. She's so small, and she's injured so badly. I've got to help this little girl. He had been hiding in a cabin in the woods, trying to hide away from the police. And he carried Elaine to this cabin. When he got to the cabin, there was a warm fire there, and he laid her gently on the bed. And he looked after her and covered her there and let her lay there. And he was so kind to her. She had lost consciousness and didn't realize it, but he was very kind. He didn't hurt her, and he kept looking at her and said, "Look at her, she's so small. She reminds me of my own daughter, my own little Sally." And then he said, "What have I done? My own Sally. I've been so evil. I've done so many bad things and left my family, and I wonder where my Sally is today." He stayed all night with Elaine in that cabin looking after her, and she was there moaning in pain. And sometimes she'd open her eyes and see and cry out, but she couldn't do anything. But the man was so kind to her. While he was looking after Elaine, Peter eventually found his way back to the campsite. He found his way back to his parents, but it was dark and they didn't know where Elaine was, and they were so concerned for her. They decided to pray and ask God, "Please help us find Elaine. Please keep her safe wherever she is." Very early the next morning when the sun came up, Peter and Mr. Owen followed back on the trail to try and find Elaine, calling, "Elaine, Elaine, Elaine," and they couldn't find her. But as they got close to the cabin where this man was, he heard them calling and he called back to them. And he went out and greeted Mr. Owen and Peter, and they said to him, and Peter said, "That's him, Dad. That's the guy. That's the guy." And the man said, "Are you looking for a young girl?" They said, "Yes." He took them back to the cabin where he had taken Elaine, and there was Elaine laying in so much pain and moaning. And the man, Mr. Owen and Peter were so relieved to find Elaine. But Mr. Owen looked at the man and said, "We've got to get her to medical attention. She's broken her leg badly and she's burning up with fever." And Mr. Owen said to the man, "You know that the police are looking for you. You must turn yourself in. Come with me to the police station and turn yourself in. I know it will not be easy for you, but it will be easier if you give yourself up instead of trying to run away from the police." The man put his head in his hands and he said, "I've done so much evil. I've done so much wrong. I don't want to go to the police, but yes, okay, I'll do what you say. But first, let's get Elaine to help." Mr. Owen and the man gently carried Elaine. They took her back to the campsite. Mrs. Owen and the kids couldn't believe it when they saw them. But Peter stayed with his mom and the kids, and Mr. Owen took this man and Elaine laying in the back seat of the car, took her into the town and straight to the hospital, and left her there under the doctor's care, while he took this man and they went to the police station. They gave the report. He told the police what he had done, and as they thought, Mr. Owen thought, the man was arrested and put in jail. But Mr. Owen promised to speak a good word for him and come back and tell the police what kindness he had shown to Elaine. Well, Elaine was in the hospital for several days. Her leg had to get set into a cast, and not only did she have a broken leg, but she had developed pneumonia from laying in the woods and being cold, and she got pneumonia, and she felt awful for several days. She slept a lot. She was taking medication. Her leg hurt so much, and she really didn't know what was happening for several days. But after a few days, she finally woke up in the hospital and looked up, and who was that sitting beside her but her mom? "Mom? Mom? You've come back from Europe?" "Yes, Elaine," her mom started to cry. "Are you okay? Are you okay? The Owens told me what happened to you, and I flew back on the first plane. I've been here with you, Elaine." "Elaine, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I left you and went away and you stayed with the Owens and then this happened. I'm so sorry. I'll never leave you again, Elaine. You must come back with me. You must come back and live with me in the city." Elaine looked at her mom. "Mom, it's okay." Her mom couldn't understand why she didn't look too happy about the thoughts of going back to live in the city. But Elaine didn't want to hurt her mom's feelings. And she said, "Mom, we'll talk about it later." The Owens came to visit her, and Elaine talked to Mrs. Owen by herself in the hospital. And she said, "Mrs. Owen, my mom wants me to go back and live in the city. I don't really want to go back. I love it here in the country with you now." Mrs. Owen reminded her, "Elaine, God has a plan for your life. And wherever he has you, whether staying here with us in the country or going back to live with your mom in the city, now that you're God's child, Jesus has promised to be with you anywhere and Wherever Jesus is, you will always have fullness of joy. Just think about it and you can make a plan. Well, after a few more days, it was finally time that Elaine was allowed to leave the hospital. And if you remember the very first time Elaine arrived at the Owens house, this is what she looked like. Do you remember how she was angry and didn't want to be there? Well, it was a totally different experience this time. She couldn't wait to go home. And when she got back to the Owens house, there they were, Peter and Janet and Johnny and Francis and baby Lucy and their dog and Robin, and they had a huge banner saying, "Welcome home, Elaine." They were so excited to see her, and she was so excited to see them. Everyone talked at once. They wanted to tell her all the news and everything that had happened. They told her that the man had been sent to jail and was going to have to spend some time in prison for breaking into Philippa's house, but that Mr. Owen was traveling back and forth to the jail to visit him and had shared the good news that Jesus loved him and had died on the cross for him. And even though he was a terrible sinner, God still loved him and could save him. And the man had asked Jesus to be his Savior. It was going to be a hard road ahead for him. After he left prison, Mr. Owen promised to help him find a job and to make better choices. But anyway, they gave him all the news, and Elaine was so excited. She was still quite weak and tired from being in the hospital, so they decided to move a bed downstairs because she couldn't climb the stairs with her broken leg, and they had a bed set up for her right by the window. Everybody decided to give her a little bit of space to have a rest. And after supper, she was laying on her bed, just resting and looking out. She looked over the hills. It was a beautiful sunset that night. And as she looked out over the hills there in the country at the Owens house, she noticed for the first time that there was a path going up one of the hills. It made her think of her favorite verse. "You will show me the path of life." God had a path for her life, a plan for her life. In your presence, in Jesus' presence, wherever she went, whether staying in the country or going back to the city, there is fullness of joy because Jesus is with her. Elaine knew she had to make a decision. Should she stay here with the Owens or go back with her mom? And that night, as the Owens came in to have family worship time, Mrs. Owen looked at her and said, "Elaine, have you made your decision?" And Elaine knew that the choice she had to make was to go back to be with her mom and live in the city. And she knew that Jesus would be with her, and that even there in the city, she could have fullness of joy because Jesus was her Savior, and she would go back and live with her mom there. But as Elaine thought back, she was so thankful for this time that she had had with the Owens. From the time when she arrived as a sad little girl with not much hope, and she was so selfish, now she was a totally different little girl. She had found fullness of joy. Her search was over. Elaine's search for joy was over because she had found that joy in Jesus. And she was so thankful for the time that she had had with the Owens. And they became friends and stayed friends for many years. And she often visited the Owens. But do you know something? You also can find the same joy that Elaine found. It's found in knowing Jesus as your Savior. And if you've never asked Jesus to be your Savior, I would encourage you to do that and know the joy that you can have in Jesus. I hope you've enjoyed this story. I've enjoyed telling it to you. And it's been a fun story, learning things from Elaine's life and the life of the Owens. And I hope you've enjoyed it. Take care.